Hello everyone. At Matthew 23, Jesus says these words, "And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness." It's absolutely stunning to behold how the religious leaders of institutional Christianity, the institutional church system, will butcher Jesus' words here. It's absolutely shocking what they do to his words. Men who claim that they are followers of Jesus, and yet they do such violence to his words that it makes it very clear that they are not men who do know Jesus. Let's just have a look at this passage beginning at verse 21. "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?' And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness." Now, I'm pretty sure that a number of you watching this video will have heard a preacher or evangelist of some sort preach to people on accepting Jesus and base his preaching around Romans 10:9-10, that if you confess Jesus as Lord, you're saved. And if you're to die tonight, you'll go to heaven. That's the language they like to use. But Jesus here tells us that such lip service isn't going to do anyone any good. When we confess Jesus is Lord, it's not just something we say. Those words actually have meaning. So when is Jesus going to say this? When does this happen? Well, he talks about entering the kingdom, and then he says, "Many will say to me on that day." He is talking about Judgment Day. And we see this kind of the same thing at Matthew 25, the sheep and goats judgment, where Jesus says to the sheep on his right, "Inherit the kingdom prepared for you." So what's Jesus talking about in Matthew 7? He's talking about entering the kingdom on that day. Judgment Day. And the only ones who will enter the kingdom are those who do the will of the Father who is in heaven. And this is where some of the games begin with these false teachers. False teachers. Jesus warned us about false teachers. Beware. Strangely enough, most people don't do this. Most people are not vigilant. Most people just assume that the false teachers are the ones that are not teaching what we're being taught in our church that we were either born in, or my church that I chose. And so they don't really need to beware. Jesus said, beware. Think about what that word means. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them. How? By their doctrines? No, by their fruits. They're in sheep's clothing. They're going to be waving a Bible around. They're going to be giving lip service to Jesus as Lord. All that kind of thing. They'll be saying words that sound good. They'll be interpreting a Bible in a way that sounds plausible to you. Even though it'll be totally wrong, it'll sound plausible. Otherwise, they wouldn't have an audience. Their lies need to sound plausible, right? Even though they are false. Here's the interesting thing about that. In the verse we are talking about here, Matthew 21, or 7:21 to 23, Jesus says that preceding this passage where he says, I never knew you. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits, those who do the will of the Father. Grapes are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor figs from thistles. So every good tree bears good fruit, does the will of the Father. But the bad tree bears bad fruit. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, nor can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Depart from me. I never knew you. So then you will know them by their fruits. Those who do the will of the Father and those who do not. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord. These false prophets will say, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father, who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? People deceived by false prophets, or the false prophets themselves. And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. Appreciate the context here, where Jesus gives this teaching, where he says, I never knew you. He's telling his disciples that are listening to him on this Sermon on the Mount, beware of false prophets. Not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, is going to enter the kingdom. Only those who do the will of the Father. You will know them by their fruits. Do they do the will of the Father? I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. You will know them by their fruits. Now let's also notice the following context, because when Jesus says this, he's not done yet. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father, who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. Therefore, When you see the word therefore, ask yourself what it is there for. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them. What words? These are the concluding remarks of Jesus in his teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. This is how he finishes his Sermon on the Mount teaching. He's talking about all the words he spoke in the Sermon on the Mount. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it did not fall, for it had been built upon the rock. Built upon the rock. How? Doing the will of the Father. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them, they don't do the will of the Father, will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. Carefully regard what Jesus is saying. Therefore, if you want to enter the kingdom of heaven, and you've heard the words I have just taught you, do them. Because if you don't do them, your house is built upon the sand. And I'm going to say to you, depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. Carefully regard what Jesus says here. This is the problem with these false teachers. They don't care what Jesus is saying here. And that's why they butcher his teaching here. And you'll see them, pull out all kinds of trickery here to nullify what Jesus is saying and what Jesus is teaching. I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them. That's the will of the Father. And why is that the will of the Father? Why is the teaching of Jesus the will of the Father? Well, we're going to see that very clearly here. The Sermon on the Mount begins this way. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. He opened his mouth and commenced to teach them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, and then he does the Beatitudes, etc., etc. That's how it began. He began to teach them. Here's how it ends. Here's how the Sermon on the Mount ends. When Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as having authority and not as their scribes. Matthew 7:28-29. So Matthew 7:28-29 comes right after he tells you to build your house upon the rock. And this completes the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. His teaching. And here's the important thing to understand. And we are shown this very clearly at John 7:14-16, and really through to verse 18, if you want to open your Bible and read it all. But when it was now the midst of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began to teach. The Jews were amazed, saying, "How has this man become learned, having never been educated?" Jesus answered them and said, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me." Jesus says this kind of thing over and over and over. And yet you'll never hear many religious leaders even talk about it. And there are a bunch of verses there. You can look up John 3:34, 8:26, etc. Those are just some of the passages where Jesus tells us this. He doesn't speak from himself, but it's his Father abiding in him that does the works. And he says this over and over again. And you should also read Acts 3:22 to 26, where Peter is referring to God's promise at Deuteronomy 18:15 to 18, where God says, "I will raise up a prophet, and I will put my words in his mouth." And Peter tells us this is Jesus. So God the Father puts his words in Jesus' mouth. And that's why Jesus says, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me." Jesus' teaching is not his, but the Father's who sent him. And Jesus tells us that he was sent in the name of his Father. So he's representing his Father and acting on God the Father's behalf. That's what that language means. And that's why this teaching is not his, but the Father's. He's acting on the Father's behalf. He comes in his Father's name. And Jesus explains in the Gospel of John that he only says what the Father is telling him to say, the Father abiding in him. Jesus' teaching is not his own, but the Father's who sent him. So this teaching in the Sermon on the Mount is the will of the Father. Jesus is delivering the Father's teaching. And that's why this teaching on the Sermon on the Mount is the will of the Father. It's the Father's teaching. And so when we come back to Matthew 7, where he says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father," it's everything he just taught. Everything he just taught. And that's why he says, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine." These words of mine. What words? Everything he just taught the people in the Sermon on the Mount. And that's why it ends by saying, "When Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as having authority and not as their scribes." End of the Sermon on the Mount. How did it begin? Jesus sat down to teach them. And his teaching is not his, but the Father's who sent him. This is the will of the Father you are hearing in the Sermon on the Mount. And again, Jesus emphasizes, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,'" just giving lip service and saying Jesus is Lord, like Paul says at Romans 10:9 to 10, isn't going to do it for you. Those words have meaning. "Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy,' etc., etc." And Jesus is going to say, "I never knew you. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say?" The word Lord means, if you confess someone as Lord, that means you're the servant and he's the Lord. And by calling him Lord, you're submitting to his authority. which means you do what he says. That's what those words mean. If you confess Jesus as Lord, it means you're submitting to Jesus Christ's authority. That's what the word Lord means. It means he's your authority. He's the one who tells you what to do. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? What is his point here? His point here is that calling Jesus Lord, but not doing what he says, is ludicrous. It's absurd. You're a self-deceived nut if that's what you're doing. Because when you call someone Lord, you serve him by doing what he says. That's what the word Lord means. And that's what it means if you confess him as Lord. You're my Lord. That means I do what you say. Everyone who comes to me and hears my words and does them, I will show you whom he is like. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid a foundation on the rock, and when a flood occurred, the torrent burst against that house and could not shake it because it had been well built. But the one who has heard and does not do them, you don't do the words of your Lord, is like a man who built a house on the ground without any foundation, and the torrent burst against it and immediately collapsed, and the ruin of that house was great. Luke 6:46-49. That's Luke's parallel account of what Jesus says in Matthew 7. Calling Jesus Lord, Lord, not doing what he says it's frankly idiotic. And that's why Jesus says this. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and yet you don't do what I say? That's like calling someone master. You repeatedly call him master, but you never do what he says. It makes no sense. And so when Jesus says, only those who do the will of the Father, it's going to be those who hear these words of mine, the words he spoke in the Sermon on the Mount, and actually does them. And then there's those who hears these words, but doesn't do them. They just give lip service and call him Lord, but they don't do what he says. And they're like a foolish man. Very foolish, because on that day, Jesus is going to say to them, get away from me. I never knew you. And if you're deceived into various beliefs by false prophets, that's going to be you if you're not listening to Jesus here. Because listening to other men isn't going to do you any good on Judgment Day. It's going to be whether you listen to Jesus Christ. Because that's what faith in Jesus Christ means. It means you believe what he says. And you do what he says. Jesus is teaching them the Father's teaching. Saw that very clearly. He tells us to beware of false teaching leading in to this passage about Lord, Lord lip service by false teachers and those who are deceived by false teachers, which is why he is telling people to beware. Only those who do the will of the Father will enter the kingdom of heaven. And how does that happen? You build your house upon the rock by doing the things you just heard in the words Jesus spoke. Because that is the will of the Father. His teaching is not his, but the Father's who sent him. The will of the Father was being taught in the Sermon on the Mount teaching. Only the one who hears these words, all the words Jesus spoke in the Sermon on the Mount, and does them, will enter the kingdom. Jesus precedes this by warning them about false teachers who will teach you otherwise. Teach you otherwise, contrary to what Jesus is teaching here. And that's why you see them working so hard to butcher Jesus' teaching. They're false teachers. But we have seen very clearly that if we read this carefully, Jesus is saying the will of the Father is to do these things I just taught you. Therefore, everyone who hears these words and does them. Therefore. So to whom will he say, I never knew you? It's going to be the people who hear what Jesus taught here and butchers his words and doesn't do them. They find excuses not to do what Jesus is saying here. Because after all, they have their man-made creeds to serve. And they would rather serve those than Jesus Christ, who does the will of my Father. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them. Those words that he's teaching on the Sermon on the Mount are the will of the Father. That's why he says, therefore. If you have been deceived by the false prophets Jesus is warning about here in Matthew 7, this could be you at Matthew 7:23. You're going to be hearing the words from Jesus, I never knew you. And all your self-affirmations in your head that you can dream up for yourself today aren't going to do you any good on Judgment Day. Jesus just told you the only thing that's going to do you any good. You have to follow his teachings. You have to do what he said. Only those who do the will of the Father will enter the kingdom of heaven. And then there's the false prophets and people who want to follow them. How do you know them? You will know them by their fruits. Well, what are their fruits? What is good fruit? People who are doing what Jesus says on the Sermon on the Mount. They're people who bless those who persecute them, who love their enemies, and so on. They don't seek attention like Jesus is talking about at the beginning of Matthew 6. That's what Jesus is talking about there with the Pharisees. They love applause and attention seekers. Bad fruit. Just go through the Sermon on the Mount and you'll see what good fruit is compared to bad fruit. It's about character, not doctrines. Only those who hear these words, such as Jesus taught on the Sermon on the Mount, but not only the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus had other teachings too. Only those who hear these words and the ones that do them will enter the kingdom on that day. Following Jesus and doing what he says is our faith. Our faith isn't just, agreeing on some idea or agreeing that Jesus is right or agreeing that some theology about Jesus is right or giving Jesus a nod. Our faith is following in him. Following in his footsteps because we trust him. We trust that he knows the way to eternal life, which he also talked about in Matthew 7. Narrow is the way, and few find it. And he also tells us, Jesus, that many will be deceived by false prophets. Many deceived, few will be saved. If you don't trust what he says and do what he says, then you really don't have faith in him, do you? These people that, they preach about this passage, Matthew 7:21 to 23, and just butcher it, they don't seem to hear Jesus. And Jesus talks about this at John 8:43 to 47, when he's speaking to the Jews and why they can't hear what he says and why they can't understand him. And he says to them, those who are of God hear the words of God. The reason you don't hear my words is because you are not of God. Why don't these preachers who are butchering this passage hear Jesus here? It's for the same reason Jesus gives at John 8:43-47. They don't want to hear what Jesus says. That was the same problem in John 8. Those Pharisees didn't want to hear what Jesus said. They didn't care. They said he had a demon and all kinds of things. They didn't really care what he said. They only cared about what they thought themselves. And there's a lot of people out there today, a lot of preachers waving around their Bible who really don't care what Jesus said. Beware of false prophets. And make sure that you're not going to be one of those people to whom Jesus says, I never knew you. Depart from me. Go away from me. Make sure. Hear Jesus and do what he says. God bless you.